again yet. And I did not want to admit it. Okay? I was scared. I never had nobody like that overpower me the way he did.
The police told me that they believed that I helped Sean murder Fred. It was a shock to hear that. The only thing that he told me was that he bug smashed him, like a bug on your windshield. At that moment, it was chaos in my own mind. That's the best way that I can explain it.
I just knew they'd be cruel, maybe slap him or like push his head or, and call him gay, call him just for a laugh. My brother called me and told me that they found Fred dead. My mom gave me a hug, told me she was sorry. And we just cried. That's how I found out. We went to where his body was, and they suggest that I don't look at it. But I wanted to see. I was hoping that I would see my son the way he was, to see him again. But it didn't turn out that way. If I had a gun, I would just go shoot his head off. That's what I said. I want to see how he feels, what he did to my baby and stuff. I like to look at his photos, and every morning I would say, I hope you're doing okay, son, up there being a precious angel. That's what I always say. Mm-hmm. Just loves to hug all the time. Mm-hmm. That's how he was. Then he loved to take pictures of Mom. I'm taking a picture with me and Mom, he would always be saying. I was a single parent. I actually had 6 boys, but Fred was the youngest. He was a cheerful, friendly person. Always want to make friends. Used to wear cowboy boots, cowboy hat. And just go like that to him with his cheeks. And I like his dimple too, every time, He was a cute little boy. He would say, I want to learn how to cut hair, or I would learn how to be a clothing designer. Well, I noticed that he was wearing makeup, and then he was wearing woman's stuff, He finally said, this is the way I'm going to be. I like being this way. Or Navajo, they call it Nutle. The word means two-spirit, Nutle. Fred wanted to be a girl and wanted to be a boy. So that's why they call it two-spirit. One time we were all home, he told us all to get in the front room, and he said, I want to tell you guys something. He says, you see me this way, and this is how I'm going to be, and this is how I'm going to look. Well, his older brother told him, you better be careful out there.
in Cortez, Colorado. Some accept for the way Fred is and some don't, so. Well, I was afraid of him being the way he wants to be, you know, but I never figured, you know, that something like this would happen to Fred.
I'm looking at the rock he used on Fred. I just don't see how a person could just take somebody and hurt them, you know, hit him with a rock in the head and then just go about his night. Somebody using that on somebody, especially towards the head, meant damage. Oh, and Fred looked beautiful. He was very confident in himself, but kids at school would just call him names and just put him down. Be mean. He wouldn't say anything to anybody, wouldn't tell him to screw off, nothing. I think Fred wouldn't fight back because he was scared. You know, he was just scared they would hurt him. I was very protective over Fred. Fred was very, you know, gentle and kind. When I'd see people pick on him, it pissed me off. I'd stand up for him because he wouldn't. Fred stayed with me a lot. All the time, pretty much. It was me and him. Whenever me and Fred would talk about how we'd be when we'd get older, would just be, you know, he'd be an auntie to my kids. He was thinking about doing hair. But whatever it was always me and him together. Every year around June, we have a carnival and rodeo. You know, it's for 3 days. And me and Fred went all 3 nights. That year, we were excited to go to the carnival. So yeah, we were just happy. Life was great. And Saturday at the carnival, we weren't there that long when he said he was gonna go home because he wasn't feeling good, and I said okay. We just said our goodbyes and we gave each other a hug and he left. And then before me and my boyfriend were leaving the carnival, somebody came up to me and told me that they seen Fred at a party that they just left. And when I heard that, I just thought that son of a bitch lied to me. Yeah, I was mad. He was my friend and it was like he ditched me to go somewhere else. I knew the house where he was at and I knew those kind of people. People that would hurt Fred, pick on Fred, just to get a laugh. I just knew they'd be cruel, you know, maybe slap him or like push his head or, you know, and call him gay, call him you know, pick on him. Didn't want them to do anything or even just hurt his feelings. I didn't want any of that for him. Because I know how hard he takes it. But I didn't really have a bad feeling that something would, like, really bad happen to him.
That's my cousin Sean. Sean made a mistake and he's paid his debt to society. I think it's important not to view him as a monster because anybody's capable of hurting another human being and making that awful mistake. At any point, somebody can make that decision to hurt somebody else. I believe the first time me and Sean met were in our teens.
Yeah, it's me, the wonderful Sean Murphy.
Well, we're not blood cousins, but we grew up calling each other cousins. We definitely came from the same type of neighborhoods and same upbringing. The neighborhoods I grew up in were pretty rough. You had to defend yourself. There was always a fight around the corner. Well, we were active gang members. Sold drugs, did drugs.
And if you don't like it, turn off TV.
Fighting. Lots of fighting.
You see? It's beautiful.
I was born into that world. You didn't realize that there was anything wrong until you got out and away from it.
This one goes in one closet, whereas this one goes in the other closet, and that's the end of my story.
Put this whole thing together, dude. I just put this whole thing together. What do you mean? Explain. What do you mean you just put this whole thing together? Y'all accusing me of murder.
At that point, I went into survival mode. Growing up the way that we did, you don't talk to police. You don't give them anything. But the police told me that they believed that I helped Sean murder Fred. And they made it very clear that I could be going away for a very long time, the rest of my life.
In the beginning of high school is when Fred changed his look, the bandana, the makeup. That's when he started with the bra and stuff. We were running towards each other in the high school field, and I'm like, Fred, when did you get those? Man, he was proud. He was happy with that. When Fred changed his whole look, he just seemed more comfortable. And, you know, that was a way he came out that gave him confidence to actually say, you know, I'm gay. After he tried to commit suicide by taking pills, I remember him laying in the bed because they had just got done pumping his stomach. It was sad. I was sad when I seen him in there like that. And he looked sad too. I think Fred always thought he was going to commit suicide. Like that was his out. If it got too much, was to do that. And he used to talk to me about that all the time, and I'd get mad at him for it. But I didn't really think he would actually ever do it because I was there to make him feel like a person.
Well, that night we were at a party, just drinking, smoking. I was in the kitchen playing poker. I remember noticing that Sean wasn't by my side at the party. We'd been up together doing the same drugs. I just figured he was hanging out with somebody else, I guess. Didn't really put a lot of thought into it then. I was told that Fred was there, but I wasn't aware of that until years later. We left the party, and I noticed that Fred was walking. I had never met him before. I don't remember specifics of the conversation. Hey man, you need a ride? It was a friendly vibe. We never asked people if they wanted a ride with bad intentions, because we've had to walk before, you know. I got off the car to get stuff, and Sean stayed in the car. He just told me what he wanted instead of going and getting it himself. From inside the store, it looked like they had been talking, yeah. It looked like them having a conversation. And then when I got into the car, it was just quiet. You don't really think about it at the time, but years later, I'm like, why was it so quiet? When I got back in the car, I asked Fred where he needed to go, and he said just up the street. I figured once he was dropped off that was the end of that story, you know? I was pretty tired. I figured we were just gonna crash, but Sean said he needed to go get some weed. There wasn't anybody in Cortez that I couldn't go get weed from. So when I offered to go with him, and he was like, no, they don't want anybody there. It was a red flag, but under the circumstances, me being tired, being a long night, I blew it off. I couldn't even give you an educated guess on how long. It wasn't hours. The next thing I know, Sean comes into the house. He's covered in blood. I asked him what happened, and he just said that he smashed him.
Smashed who?
He didn't say. The only thing that he told me was that he bug smashed him, like a bug on your windshield. And that was the only thing. He didn't say much. He used the word him. I figured it was a fair fight between two guys. That was kind of our mentality, though, not to ask questions. All the blood was alarming. I didn't understand where it all came from. I knew it had to be something serious. At that moment, it was chaos in my own mind. That's the best way that I can explain it. I told Sean to change and to give me his clothes and let me get rid of them. We put him in a bag, took him with us to New Mexico, where a few days later I tried to get rid of him.
The last night that I saw him was that he was leaving with some friends to the carnival and rodeo in Cortez. And he says, Mom, I'm going to the carnival with my friends. I guess that's the last time I went to see him. He said, Mom, I love you. When I woke up next morning, I looked down, checked down there where he sleeps, and he in the bedroom, and he wasn't there. And that's when I told the boys, I said, you have any idea where he's at? Where did he go? He didn't come home. And they said, well, he didn't come back last night. And I said, which friends did he go with? I said, go ask around. So we started asking around, and that following evening he still didn't show up, so I called about it to the police station. I called and called and called around, and we all looked around, nothing. I said, there's something wrong.
The first time I got worried was when Pauline called asking if Fred was at our house. And I told her no, I haven't seen Fred since the carnival. When I really started to worry was when the paper came out, it said they found a grown man's body. And my mom was like, what if that's Fred? But my mom knew how people were with Fred and how people were mean. And like I said, I got mad when she said that what if that's Fred? I didn't want to think bad things, so it pissed me off when she told me that.
I was at work and my boss came over and told me that there's some officer here to talk to you. And I think you better sit down, he told me. And I said, just come out and tell me what is it. That's when they told me it was Fred's body that they found. There was some kids playing around and they said they found a body there. And they told me that they found out that it was him. He just said he's been there probably for quite a while. That's all I hear. And they identify him with his tooth. That's my baby. That's my son that I carried for 9 months. I said, why? He did nothing wrong. I would never get over this. Most painful thing to go through, I said. I was lost. I was like, what am I supposed to do? Where do I start? All I did was cry, cry, cry.
My brother called me and told me that I better get a hold of Pauline because they found Fred dead. I called Pauline and I asked her what happened, and I said, did Fred commit suicide? And she started crying, saying, no, they killed my baby. My mom showed up right away, like right after I was done talking to Pauline, and my mom gave me a hug. Told me she was sorry. And we just hugged and cried. That's how I found out.
I knew that they were investigating a murder in Cortez. Well, I had no idea that it was Fred at all. My whole impression was that it was just that Sean had only gotten into a fight.
Yes, I just want to tell you what I've heard about the murder of the boy, that Sean Marsden and Clint did it with a hammer. That's all I can say, and I don't want to get in trouble, so that's all I'm going to say. They were here for the carnival. Okay, but...
I I'd been trying to get rid of the clothes for a while. I knew that they were evidence of whatever happened. And when Sean finally gave them to me, I got a ride immediately to take them out of the house. I threw them in a dumpster. I thought I was doing good. I thought I was helping. And I think me and Sean were the last people to know that we were being sought after. I didn't know they were already following us. They were already watching.
Me and my mom went down there to where they found his body, and there was a outline of Fred's body. One of the things I was told is that there was a struggle. That's why there was bandanas thrown around. Fred used to fill up a bra with bandanas for his chest, so that's what those were. After going there and seeing where he was and, the body outline and knowing he got hit in the head with the rock and that he could have been there for a couple of days just burning in the sun because he couldn't get up. I had nightmares about it. I'd wake up scared and crying, my dream would be like Fred out there crying for me, asking for me to help him or him just crying laying there.
Well, I figured a dumpster toss was good enough instead of burning them. So after I threw the clothes, I made it back to the house and I left again to go get some weed. When I walked out the door, there was a bunch of cops with their rifles on me. One of them had snuck up behind me. He had me at gunpoint and told me to lie down on the ground. They put me in an interview room, handcuffed to the table, started questioning me. At first, I was quiet.
We're looking at a homicide investigation. We talked to a bunch of people. It's a case up in Cortez up there, 15-year-old kid that got killed out there. He's kid, Well, you're one of two people that we're looking at right now real hard.
You're saying the other one's my cousin Sean? Yeah. I don't know what to tell you back.
Well, I'll tell you what the problem we're going to have, my friend, is, like I said, we were watching you today, and one of the things that people saw you do is deposit some items in a dumpster. And if we find some blood belonging to the victim in our case up there, how much more do you think that we need than that to take you to court and probably convict you?
I mean, this is my life.
Why are you getting rid of your shoes? I'm sorry? Now's the time, man. Now's the time. Because what I saw today was you tossing a pair of shoes.
Hey, tell us about that. Who are you doing the favor for? Huh? Hey, I understand loyalty and friendship and all that, but you gotta understand that.
Yeah, right.
At some point, the detective said something about spending the rest of my life in prison for killing a gay Native American boy, teenager. It was a shock to hear that.
What would you say was your reaction to finding out it was Fred?
This poor kid. This poor baby. The moment I knew that I would have to tell the truth was when the investigators told me that it was Fred
Are you ready to go down for killing a 15-year-old kid? Were you there? Did you do it?
I remember thinking that when he showed up covered in blood, that he had gotten into a fair fight with another guy and that he was the victor. And I was okay with that. But it wasn't until the police dragged us in and pointed out who the victim was that changed things. I remember what Fred looked like. He was small. I'd even use the word petite. It wouldn't take much to overpower him in a fight. It went from a fair fight to an unfair fight, and a kid's life was lost.
I mean, is there, as we sit here today, based on the conversations that you had with them, who killed Fred in your mind?
Killed Fred in my mind. Sean did.
I went against everything that I had ever been taught. It affected every decision I'd make after. And I had to live with it and carry it.
I had no clue.
And I just wondered if he ever said, you know, more stuff after that, like, you remember that guy that we picked up? Just...
Maybe Sean was mad because somebody might maybe get your.
You sure he didn't tell you, I'm gonna go kick somebody's ass and pissed him off about something, or I'm gonna go find this guy and make sure he knows I'm not gay, or...
I don't know what Sean was thinking. For me to answer that would be like putting words in his mouth.
So I was scared of a gay guy, and I did not want to admit it, okay? I did what I had to do to get away. I was scared. I never had nobody like that overpower me the way he did.
We went to where his body was, and they suggest that I don't look at it. They don't want me to look at it. But I wanted to see. I was hoping that I would see my son the way he was, to see him again. But it didn't turn out that way. What Sean Murphy did to my son was he mashed his head in so many times with a rock until he killed him and left him out there for the animals to have him. If I had a gun, I would just go shoot his head off. That's what I said. I want to see how he feels, what he did to my baby, I said.
We went down there, and I was like, why the move that way the down here? Why do you want me to come down here and smoke more with you? I was smoking more, you just getting me overpowered. You had me on the ground where your friend was.
What was he trying to do to you?
I just want to find out what he was trying to do to me. He hit me, it knocked me back, you know, caught me off guard, he took over power. I fell on some rocks and I was trying to hit him, you know, off me. And he was overpowering me, he hit me a couple more times, and I hit him with a rock.
don't believe that it was self-defense against Fred. I really don't. Because Fred wasn't violent. It wouldn't have been him who started hitting Sean Murphy or something, you know? Like I said, he wouldn't even stand up to people that were mean to him. I do have my own ideas of what happened, and I think Sean Murphy led Fred on that they were going to have a hookup down there. Couldn't think of anything of why he would be down there. He was so scared of the dark, and that was his worst fear. The only reason Fred would go down there is to have a hookup, like sexual relations with Sean Murphy. That's the only reason Fred would go down there. And if they did or didn't, I don't know, but that's the only way Fred would have went down there. I know that for a fact.
A good friend of Fred's knew him to have hookups. It's possible it was Sean down there for a hookup.
The events of that night are still a big puzzle. I don't have all the facts. I don't know everything that went on. They said that his body was completely smashed into the ground with a rock. His blood turned the dirt into mud. I was just asking why. I didn't understand why that would have happened. I can only account for myself. It changed my life. I mean, I'm here 20 years later and it's still affecting every decision that I make for myself and my children. The last time I spoke to Sean was the day that we were arrested. My life's in a different direction. I've been sober for 4 years. And I haven't been in a fist fight for 5. I'm pretty proud of that. I do believe that Sean regrets what he did. I hope that he's at peace with things. I hope that he's enjoying life and that he can be happy. And I hope you guys use that.
I hope the show just makes other people realize just because somebody's gay, you know, they're still a person. When you say names, and it might be a joke to you, but it's not. It's not to that person. When Sean Murphy took Fred out of this world, he took, you know, not just my best friend, he just took my person, you know, and still to this day, it kills me that I don't have Fred here.
I can't answer why Sean killed my son. I can't answer. I don't know why. And I keep thinking about, I wonder if he knew him or what, you know, I keep thinking about that. I never did find the answer. I don't know. I lost my job. I lost everything. everything I had, down to nothing. And then I got in a bad accident. And the doctors put me all back together. After I got better, I got cancer again. So I'm a cancer survivor too. I say, why all the suffering? Why do I have to go through this? And then again, I always think that it must be my prayer. Somebody up there loves me, keeps me going. He wanted to go to California. That was his dream. He said, I'm going to California. I'm going to ride him in a limousine, a long black one, he would say. You watch me, I'll do it. He would say that. I went to Hollywood. I rode in a black limousine for him. This is for you, son, I told him.
There are towns I forget, places where memories fade beneath new roads, new houses, new generations. Then there are towns that remember every detail, every scream, every unanswered question, every face on a faded missing person poster curling at the edges of a convenience store window. For 32 years, the people of Ashford carried a ghost. No one spoke about it every day. Life moved on. Children grew up. Businesses opened and closed. Seasons came and went, but the ghost remained. A photograph, a smile, a girl who never came home. On a cold October evening in 1989, 17-year-old Emily Carter left her part-time job at a grocery store just after 9 o'clock. The shift had been ordinary. Customers buying milk, parents dragging sleepy children through checkout lines, a cashier counting loose change. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable, the kind of night that disappears into history. Emily walked out into the darkness, carrying her denim jacket over one shoulder. Witnesses later said she appeared relaxed, happy even. She waved goodbye to co-workers. She crossed the parking lot. She got into her aging blue sedan. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. By midnight, her parents were worried. By dawn, they were terrified. By the following afternoon, police officers were knocking on doors across town. The search exploded. Volunteers combed fields. Helicopters circled overhead. Bloodhounds followed trails that vanished into nothing. Flyers covered telephone poles. Local news stations interrupted programming. A teenage girl had disappeared, without a trace. No ransom call. No suspicious withdrawals. No evidence she had planned to run away. Just silence. The kind of silence that terrifies investigators. Because silence means possibilities. And possibilities can hide monsters. 3 days later, Emily's car was discovered abandoned near a wooded service road 15 miles outside town. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The driver's door was locked. The keys were gone. Inside, investigators found nothing immediately alarming. No blood. No obvious signs of violence. No fingerprints belonging to strangers. It looked almost normal. Almost. But detectives noticed something strange. The driver's seat had been pushed significantly farther back than Emily normally positioned it. Whoever drove the vehicle last was taller than she was. That single detail ignited speculation. Had someone forced her from the car? Had someone driven it there afterward? Or had investigators just stumbled upon a meaningless coincidence? The questions multiplied. The answers never came. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The Carter family remained trapped in a nightmare with no ending. Every ringing phone triggered hope. Every knock at the door sparked panic. Every unidentified body discovered anywhere in the state forced them to relive the horror all over again. Yet Emily remained missing. The case slowly transformed into what newspapers would eventually call a cold case. 2 words. Cold case. Simple. Clinical. But for the people living inside it, There was nothing cold about it. The pain remained alive. The fear remained alive. The uncertainty remained alive. Investigators followed hundreds of leads. A truck driver claimed he had seen a young woman matching Emily's description at a roadside diner. False alarm. A convicted offender allegedly confessed to the crime while serving time. False alarm. A psychic pointed authorities to a remote lake. Nothing. Another witness reported screams in the woods. Nothing. Every lead collapsed. Every theory disintegrated. And then something happened. Something that transformed a tragic disappearance into a legend whispered across generations. A letter arrived. No return address. No fingerprints. No explanation. Inside was a single photograph. Emily. The image appeared recent. Far more recent than her disappearance. In the photograph, she was standing beside a fence. Alive. Looking directly into the camera. The town erupted. National media descended upon Ashford. Experts examined the image. Families watched nightly news broadcasts, hoping for a breakthrough. Was Emily alive? Had she been kidnapped? Was someone taunting investigators? Forensic analysts eventually delivered devastating news. The photograph could not be authenticated. The original source was unknown. The date could not be verified. The image became another mystery layered on top of an already impossible mystery. Years continued passing. The photograph remained, a haunting artifact, a puzzle with no solution. By the late 1990s, many investigators had retired. Boxes filled with reports gathered dust in storage rooms. New detectives inherited old frustrations. The case had become famous for all the wrong reasons. Students studied it. Journalists revisited it. True crime books mentioned it. Yet nobody solved it. Nobody even came close. Then another strange detail surfaced. A retired mechanic named Walter Jennings contacted authorities. For years, he had remained silent. Now, he claimed he remembered something from the week Emily disappeared. A dark pickup truck, parked near the grocery store, night after night, always in the same area, always occupied by a lone man. Walter remembered because the truck looked unusual. An older model, customized grille, distinctive damage near the rear bumper. At first, investigators dismissed the recollection. The memory was decades old. Witness reliability decreases over time. Everyone knew that, but detectives checked anyway. And what they found chilled them. Multiple witness statements from 1989 mentioned a similar vehicle. The information had been buried inside thousands of pages of reports. Never fully explored. Never connected. Somehow lost inside the chaos. The discovery reignited interest. Maybe the answer had been sitting in front of investigators all along. Maybe the killer had slipped through their fingers because one clue disappeared beneath mountains of paperwork. The possibility was unbearable. Detectives reopened interviews. Old names resurfaced. Old suspects resurfaced. Old secrets resurfaced. Families who thought the nightmare was over suddenly found reporters standing outside their homes again. Ashford felt different. Tense. Uneasy. Like a wound reopening after decades. Then came the breakthrough nobody expected. Not from a witness. Not from a confession. Not from a hidden diary. From science. A technology that barely existed when Emily vanished. A technology capable of reaching backward through time. Into forgotten evidence. Into sealed boxes. Into decades-old mistakes. For years, investigators had preserved several items recovered from Emily's abandoned vehicle. At the time, testing capabilities were limited. Many samples were considered too small, too degraded, too insignificant. Now, advancements allowed laboratories to extract information once believed impossible to recover. Evidence technicians reopened the boxes, one by one, every item photographed, every item cataloged, every item examined. The process felt routine, almost boring, until one result arrived. A single profile, incomplete, tiny, fragile, but real. For the first time in over 30 years, investigators possessed biological evidence, potentially belonging to someone connected to Emily's disappearance. The room reportedly fell silent when analysts delivered the findings, because everyone understood the implications. The ghost was moving. The dead end was no longer dead. Somewhere, someone who believed they had escaped justice forever might suddenly be vulnerable, might suddenly be visible, might suddenly be afraid. And for the first time in decades, Ashford dared to believe that the impossible could happen, that a forgotten cold case could return from the grave, that a name hidden in darkness could finally emerge, that somewhere beyond the stacks of reports, beyond the fading memories, beyond the years of grief and unanswered questions, a killer was still out there, breathing, aging, waiting, and completely unaware that the hunt had just begun again. The lab report arrived without ceremony, without warning, without the kind of dramatic timing that movies like to pretend defines truth. It came as a file, a sequence of numbers, a profile stitched together from fragments so small they would have been meaningless in 1989. But in the present moment, in the quiet tension of a reopened case room where old evidence boxes had been stacked like coffins waiting to be opened, those numbers carried weight. Not certainty, not yet, but direction. Detectives gathered under fluorescent lights that never seemed to soften anything, not grief, not memory, not the uneasy feeling that justice had been delayed long enough to become something else entirely. The analyst pointed to the screen. A partial match, she said, not in any national criminal database, not in any direct offender registry hit, but a trace profile consistent with male DNA, recovered from a degraded sample inside the trunk lining of Emily Carter's abandoned vehicle, the same vehicle that had been sitting in evidence storage for over 3 decades, untouched except for dust and silence. The room didn't explode with excitement. It tightened, because partial match meant something worse than resolution. It meant proximity. It meant someone had been close enough to leave a biological signature, but not close enough to be immediately identified. It meant the killer, if that word was even correct, had existed in the blind spot of old investigative limitations. Names returned to the table. Old suspects who had once been questioned and released. Men who had lived in Ashford in 1989 and then scattered like seeds when attention faded. The grocery store manager who had worked late shifts and always seemed to be in the background of witness statements. A mechanic with a reputation for keeping odd hours, and a truck that matched fragmented descriptions. A transient laborer who had left town shortly after the disappearance and never returned. Each name now carried a different weight, no longer just speculation, but potential connection. And then one detail resurfaced, almost forgotten in the chaos of earlier years. A parking ticket, issued 2 weeks before Emily disappeared. The vehicle listed matched the description of the dark pickup truck, remembered by Walter Jennings. Same model range, same distinctive rear damage. The ticket had been filed, processed, and archived without consequence. No one had connected it to anything significant at the time. It had been just another minor violation in a stack of municipal paperwork. Until now, detectives pulled the old record. The name on the registration was still legible beneath faded ink and outdated database formatting. A man who had lived on the edge of town. Not famous, not notorious, just present enough to exist in memory, absent enough to avoid scrutiny. His name sat on the page like a dormant signal, finally receiving power. But names alone were not enough. Not in a case like this. Not after 32 years of silence. So they moved carefully, quietly. Interviews were reopened under the pretense of routine cold case review, a phrase that meant nothing to outsiders, but everything to those inside the system. People who had been teenagers in 1989 were now middle-aged, some elderly, their memories softened by time, but not erased. Some had moved away. Some had built entire lives on top of what they claimed not to remember. Yet patterns emerge again, as they always do when truth has been buried but not destroyed. A former co-worker of Emily's described a man who occasionally appeared outside the grocery store after closing hours. Not inside. Never inside. Always near the edge of the parking lot. Always watching a way that felt like waiting. At the time, it had been dismissed as coincidence, the imagination of a young employee working late shifts alone. Now it felt different. Heavier. More deliberate. Another witness, now living 3 states away, recalled a vehicle idling with headlights off, engine running low, night after night, for a week leading up to the disappearance. The kind of detail that disappears in real time, but returns in memory when prompted by fear or distance. The truck had not moved quickly. It had not drawn attention. It had simply existed, patient, almost invisible in its persistence. And beneath all of this, something more unsettling began to form. Not a single narrative, but a pattern of presence. A man who was not directly connected to Emily in any obvious social way. No known relationship, no public interaction, no recorded disputes, and yet too often nearby, too often present in the same peripheral spaces where ordinary life unfolded. Investigators felt the shape of something without being able to define it. That is the most dangerous stage in a cold case. When intuition begins to replace evidence, and evidence is still just out of reach, then came the photograph again. The same image that had haunted the Carter family for decades. The image that had arrived in silence without return address. Emily standing near a fence, looking into the camera with an expression that refused to explain itself. It had been dismissed years ago as inconclusive, possibly manipulated, possibly staged. But new enhancement technology allowed analysts to revisit its structure in ways that had not been possible before. They analyzed shadows, light direction, grain patterns, environmental markers hidden in the background, and slowly, something emerged that no one expected, a partial reflection in a metallic surface just beyond the edge of the frame. Not clear, not identifiable in a traditional sense, but consistent with a silhouette, a man-shaped outline positioned behind the camera, not in front of it. The implication was immediate and suffocating. The photograph was not a snapshot taken from a distance. It was controlled, composed. Someone had stood there. Someone had positioned her. Someone had taken the image deliberately. And if that was true, then Emily had not simply vanished. She had been managed. The word itself spread quietly through the investigation team. Managed. It sounded clinical, almost bureaucratic. But beneath it lay something far darker. Control, duration, intent that extended beyond a single moment of violence. Pressure built. Surveillance was authorized. Old properties were checked again. Vehicles that had long since been scrapped were traced through ownership history. One address, long abandoned, resurfaced in county records tied to the name now under renewed scrutiny. A property on the outskirts of Ashford, surrounded by overgrown land and a fence that had not been repaired in years. When detectives visited the location, they did not announce themselves. They observed first. The house stood as if time had avoided it rather than passed through it. Windows opaque with age. Structure intact but neglected in a way that suggested deliberate distance from the outside world. No visible movement. No immediate signs of occupancy. But something felt wrong in the stillness. Not evidence of crime. Not yet. Something more subtle, like a place waiting for recognition. Inside the investigation headquarters, tension shifted, not toward certainty, but toward anticipation. Because every cold case carries a moment like this, a point where decades of abstraction begin to condense into a physical location, a place that might still hold answers, or nothing at all. And in Ashford, after 32 years of silence, the difference between those two outcomes felt thinner than air. The case was no longer just about what happened in 1989. It was about what had survived since then. Hidden, undisturbed, waiting for someone brave or reckless enough to open it again. A quiet house on the outskirts of Ashford does not look like the center of storm until you understand what silence can hide. From the outside, it remained unchanged weatherwood, a sagging fence line, a driveway swallowed by weeds that had grown undisturbed for years. No lights. No movement, no sound, but silence in investigations like this is never empty. It is only untested. Detectives approach it the way you approach something that might already be watching you. No sirens, no uniforms clearly displayed at first glance. Just distance, observation, and the slow tightening of certainty that this place mattered more than it should have. Records said it belonged, decades ago, to the same name that had resurfaced through the partial DNA profile. The same man tied to the parking ticket. The same man tied to witness descriptions that had been scattered across forgotten files. Now, the address was no longer just ink on paper. It was a coordinate in time. A decision was made quickly but quietly. Surveillance first. Entry only if necessary. Cold cases are often lost not because evidence is absent, but because urgency destroys context. And context, after 32 years, was everything. Hours passed, then days. The house did not change, but the investigation around it did. Old utility records were pulled, phone lines traced, property tax filings reviewed. Everything pointed to abandonment in the early 1990s, right around the time the case had collapsed into silence. A coincidence that no one in the room believed was coincidence anymore. Then a detail surfaced that shifted the entire atmosphere. A maintenance record from a county inspection in the late 1990s mentioned intermittent occupancy. A phrase so vague it had been ignored for decades, but now it felt like a pulse. Someone at some point had been there after the disappearance, after the investigation went cold, after the world moved on. Inside the briefing room, the photograph of Emily Carter was placed on the table again. The same image, same uncertainty, same haunting stillness. But now it was no longer just evidence of possible survival or manipulation. It was evidence of proximity. Someone had been close enough to control the narrative of her existence, even after she vanished from public view. And that changed everything. A new team was assigned to review every known movement of the property owner during the months following October 1989. Employment records, vehicle registrations, utility usage spikes, anything that could place a human presence in or around Ashford during the critical window. The pattern that emerged was fragmented but unsettling. Short gaps of absence followed by returns. Transactions in nearby towns under slightly varying records. A life that did not move in a straight line, but in hesitation. Meanwhile, field surveillance confirmed something else. The house was not entirely abandoned. One night, just after midnight, a faint light appeared in the rear window. Not steady, not sustained. A flicker, like a flashlight being used briefly and then concealed. Long enough to be seen. Short enough to be missed if no one was watching closely. The surveillance team froze a moment, zoomed in, recorded, but no figure could be clearly identified. Still, it was enough. A warrant discussion began immediately, but was not yet approved. Probable cause still required more than instinct. It required connection. And connection, in cold cases, is always the hardest thing to prove when time has erased everything except suspicion. Inside that tension, a new piece of evidence arrived from the forensic lab. A secondary analysis of trace fibers recovered from Emily's vehicle. Not DNA this time. Something older, more physical. Microscopic strands embedded in trunk-lining fabric. The kind of detail that had been cataloged but never fully interpreted in 1989 due to technological limitations. The fibers were matched to a specific type of synthetic material used in industrial-grade vehicle upholstery. Not common, not widely distributed. Used primarily in fleet modifications and custom repairs. The kind of detail that narrows the world instead of expanding it. And then came the overlap, a service receipt, dated months before Emily's disappearance. A vehicle repair record linked to the same pickup truck repeatedly mentioned in witness statements. The same truck with the distinctive rear damage. The same truck that had appeared near the grocery store in the final weeks before she vanished. The repair had been done at a small workshop outside town. A workshop still operating under a different owner. When detectives visited, the Kerr mechanic initially dismissed questions as routine cold case curiosity, old stories, old rumors. But when shown the partial registration details, his expression changed. Not fear, not guilt, recognition. He remembered the truck. He remembered the damage. And more importantly, he remembered who brought it in. The description matched a man already under quiet observation. The name on the property record. The name tied to the partial DNA profile. The name that had been sitting in files for decades without ever becoming the center of attention. Now it was becoming unavoidable. Back at the house, surveillance intensified. Night vision cameras replaced older equipment. Audio capture expanded. Patrol rotations increased. The house remained mostly still, But the idea of stillness no longer meant safety. It meant waiting, and then, without warning, movement. A vehicle approached late at night. No headlights until the final moment. Slow arrival. Controlled stop. The same shape as a long-described pickup truck. The same silhouette that had haunted witness statements for decades. The engine cut off. A door opened. A figure stepped out. No confrontación. No immediate arrest. Just observation. Because in cases like this, one wrong move can erase decades of patience. The figure did not enter the house immediately. Instead, he stood near the driveway for several seconds, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he moved toward the rear entrance, disappearing from surveillance angle for a brief moment that felt longer than it should have. Inside the command center, silence tightened again. Every screen focused. Every officer aware that something had just shifted from theory to reality. The past was no longer buried. It was active, and whatever had been hidden inside that house for decades was no longer alone. The moment the figure disappeared behind the rear line of the house, everything in the command center changed its temperature. Not physically, but perceptually, like the air itself had recognized the threshold being crossed. Cameras kept rolling. Monitors stayed steady, but the investigators watching them leaned forward, as if proximity alone could sharpen the image. No one spoke at first, because speaking would turn possibility into procedure, and procedure into consequence. And consequences, in cases this old, carry weight that cannot be undone. Outside, the property remained dark. The truck sat motionless near the driveway, its silhouette half swallowed by the reach of a broken streetlight. The house did not reveal anything new. It never did. Houses like this rarely give answers willingly. They only react when forced. Then, inside the surveillance feed, a faint movement. Light shifting through a narrow gap in the rear structure. Not a flashlight beam now, but something more sustained. A doorway being opened. A threshold crossed from outside to inside. The building exhaled dust and stillness as if disturbed for the first time in years. The entry was not rushed. It was controlled, deliberate. That detail alone changed the interpretation of everything. This was not someone stumbling into memory. This was someone returning to it. Inside the house, the audio feed picked up faint structural sounds. Floorboards adjusting under weight. A door hinge resisting and then yielding. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. In the command center, a decision formed without words. If there was ever a moment to escalate, it was now. But escalation required clarity, and clarity required confirmation that what they were watching was not simply trespass, but connection to the case. 32 years of investigation had taught everyone in that room the same lesson. Certainty arrives late, and usually after hesitation. Then a second camera angle flickered into partial obstruction. Something passed close to the lens, not visible in full, just shape and motion. Enough to confirm proximity to interior space. Enough to confirm that the house was no longer just a structure. It was active ground. A tactical team was moved into position. Slowly. Quietly. No lights beyond necessity. The road leading to the property became a corridor of controlled tension. Every movement measured, every instruction clipped short. Radios carried voices that tried to remain calm, but could not fully hide the pressure of timing. Inside the house, the feed stabilized briefly. A hallway came into view. Narrow, old wallpaper peeling, in long vertical lines. The kind of interior that had not been updated since the era of the original disappearance. The kind of place that preserves time instead of living in it. Then something unexpected appeared in the frame. A door that was not fully closed. Behind it, faint illumination. Not natural, not ambient. Artificial, controlled. The kind of light that belongs to intention. And for the first time since surveillance began, the investigation was no longer watching absence. It was watching presence. Outside, the pickup truck remained parked. But now it felt different. Not like transportation. Like confirmation. A link between past witness statements and present reality. The same vehicle shape that had been described inconsistently for decades suddenly felt undeniably real under modern observation. A request came through to maintain visual contact at all costs. No interruption. No premature entry unless absolute necessity emerged. Because inside that house, after 32 years, the possibility existed that something more than evidence was present, something that might disappear if disturbed too quickly. Then the audio feed caught a voice, not clear enough for words, but unmistakably human. Male, low, controlled, not panicked, not surprised. A tone that suggested familiarity with isolation, as if speaking inside that house was not unusual. The command center froze again, because voices change everything. Evidence can be stored, objects can be cataloged, locations can be preserved, but a voice implies immediacy. It implies current existence. It implies that the past is no longer past. A second sound followed, a metallic shift, something being moved, something heavier than a simple object, but not large enough to suggest furniture. The kind of sound that makes investigators rethink spatial layouts in real time, mentally reconstructing rooms they have never physically entered. Then silence returned. Not the original silence of abandonment, a different kind, a silence that follows action. Outside, tactical units were now positioned at multiple entry points. Front, rear, side, all angles covered, all waiting for final authorization. Inside, the surveillance feed briefly glitched. A distortion, a momentary loss of clarity. When it returned, the hallway was empty, but the door that had been partially open was now fully closed. That detail alone triggered immediate concern, because nothing closes itself in an abandoned house unless something is still there to close it. The lead investigator stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because he was uncertain of what he was seeing, but because he understood what it meant if he acknowledged it aloud. After decades of procedural distance, everything had collapsed into a single moment of proximity. Then came the update from the perimeter team. No visual of exit, no movement from the truck, no secondary figure observed leaving the structure. The only confirmed change was internal. Something had shifted inside the house, and it was no longer visible. The warrant authorization finally arrived, delayed but inevitable. Legal permission to enter was now active. The timing was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. But before the entry order could be executed, another sound broke through the audio feed. A sudden impact. Not loud enough to be explosive. Not soft enough to be accidental. A controlled strike, followed by a second. Then the unmistakable sound of a door resisting force from the inside. The house was no longer passive. It was reacting. And every investigator watching understood in the same quiet instant that whatever had lived in that silence for 32 years was no longer content to remain hidden. The door gave way not with a cinematic explosion, but with the ugly reality of old would surrender to pressure it was never meant to resist. Inside the surveillance feed, the frame shook violently for a fraction of a second, then stabilized just long enough to show what everyone had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. The interior threshold had been breached from the outside. Tactical units moved in without hesitation now. The waiting phase was over. Every step forward carried the weight of 3 decades of unanswered questions compressed into motion. Flashlights cut through the darkness in sharp, controlled beams, sweeping over walls that had not seen attention in years. Dust rose in faint clouds, disturbed by boots that sounded too loud in a space that had been too quiet for too long. The house reacted immediately in subtle ways. Creaks, settling timber, the soft complaint of the structure forced to acknowledge human presence again. But there was no chaos, no fleeing figure, no immediate confrontation, only absence shaped into architecture. Room by room, they moved. The front area was empty, bare, stripped of anything personal. No furniture that suggested daily life. No signs of recent habitation, in the traditional sense. It looked less like a home and more like a holding space, something designed to contain time rather than participate in it. Then the hallway, the same corridor seen on surveillance, now experienced directly, wallpaper peeling like old skin, floorboards uneven under pressure. And at the end, the door that had been partially closed earlier now stood slightly ajar again, as if undecided in its final position. One officer raised a hand. The team slowed. Silence reclaimed the space in a different form now. Not absence, but anticipation. The door was opened. Inside, The room was smaller than expected, windowless, controlled lighting powered by a single source in the corner. Not a modern setup, not improvised chaos. Something deliberate, something maintained. And there, in the center of the space, were objects that immediately changed the emotional temperature of the entire investigation. Not bodies, not violence in the immediate sense, but arrangement, photographs, paper records, maps, old news clippings pinned and layered across a wall that had effectively become a timeline. And at the center of it all, a single image that every investigator recognized instantly. Emily Carter, the same photograph, the same face, but now surrounded by context that had never been seen before. Strings connected locations, dates marked in ink, routes traced across a map of Ashford and its surrounding roads, patterns that were not random but constructed. The room was not a storage space. It was a system. One officer whispered something under his breath, but no one acknowledged it because the realization had already settled in quietly across the team. This was not just evidence of disappearance. This was evidence of structure, of planning extended over time, of attention sustained long beyond the moment of vanishing. And then something else caught their attention. A chair in the corner, occupied, not by sudden movement, not by confrontation, but by stillness, so complete it almost blended into the environment itself. A man sat there, hands resting loosely, posture calm in a way that felt disconnected from the situation unfolding around him. He did not react immediately to the entry. He did not stand. He did not reach for anything visible. He simply looked at them. That was worse than resistance, because resistance implies surprise. This did not. The lead officer gave a verbal command, voice controlled but firm, identifying presence, ordering compliance. The man did not respond right away. Instead, his gaze shifted slightly, not toward the officers, but toward the wall of photographs behind them, as if acknowledging something already completed rather than something currently happening. Then finally he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be heard in the confined space. The words themselves were not immediately recorded clearly in the chaos of overlapping audio feeds, but the tone was unmistakable, calm, measured, detached from urgency. One officer stepped forward, attempting to close distance. Another raised a weapon, not fired, but ready. The tension in the room condensed into a single unstable point, and then the name came through the radio from outside. Confirmation had arrived from digital cross-referencing, initiated minutes earlier during the entry. Old property records, archive repair logs, partial DNA profile comparisons that had just completed in real time due to system priority escalation. The man in the chair was no longer just a person of interest. He was the same name that had resurfaced through decades of fragmented evidence. The name tied to the truck, the name tied to property, the name tied to the partial biological trace recovered from Emily Carter's vehicle. And now, finally, the name tied to a physical presence inside the very space that had been silent for 32 years. Inside the room, nothing moved for a brief, suspended moment. Even the officers seemed to hesitate, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition finally meeting reality. Cold cases often live in abstraction. Paper, files, reports. But this was no longer abstraction. It was proximity. The man in the chair leaned slightly forward, not in aggression, but in acknowledgement that the moment had arrived. His eyes did not scan for escape routes. He did not appear surprised by the escalation. If anything, there was a faint sense of resolution in his posture, as if the interruption was simply the final page of something already written long ago. Outside, backup units continued to secure the perimeter. Radios crackled with overlapping instructions. The case that had once been a collection of unanswered questions was now a live containment scenario. And somewhere in that shifting balance between past and present, one fact became impossible to ignore. Whatever had happened to Emily Carter was no longer just a mystery preserved in files. It had been anchored here, in this room, in this silence, and in the man who had been sitting inside it long before anyone decided to open the door. The room did not erupt into chaos the way training manuals sometimes predict. There was no sudden confession, No dramatic collapse. No cinematic confession of guilt shouted over the sound of flashing lights. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. Control. The kind that holds even under pressure, even under exposure. Even when 32 years of silence has finally been broken open like a sealed wound, the man in the chair remained seated, not restrained, not resisting, not attempting escape, just present, as if the presence of armed officers inside a sealed room had always been part of the expected outcome. His hands rested loosely on his knees, fingers still, posture steady, the kind of stillness that does not come from shock, but from familiarity. One officer moved in closer, issuing commands again, clear, repeated, legally precise. Stand up, show hands, identify yourself. The words filled a small room and bounced off walls layered with photographs and maps that now felt less like investigative material and more like documentation of obsession stretched across time. The man finally obeyed, slowly rising to his feet, not abruptly, not defensively, a controlled motion, almost careful, like someone stepping out of a long-held position rather than surrendering it. When he stood, he did not face the officers immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted once more toward the wall of evidence behind them. Emily Carter's image remained at the center. That single photograph had survived decades of uncertainty, reinterpretation, and rumor. Now it sat under artificial light, surrounded by lines, dates, and fragments of meaning that had never been visible to the outside world. One of the officers asked again for identification. The voice this time carried more force, less procedural patience. The response did not come immediately. Instead, there was a pause that felt deliberately placed, like a space between chapters that should not exist. Then the man spoke his name. It was the same name that had just been confirmed outside the house moments earlier, transmitted through multiple agencies, verified through overlapping historical records, financial archives, and forensic correlation. A name that had existed in the background of this case for decades without ever fully entering its center. Now it was inside the room. Now it had a voice. Outside, the situation tightened further. Perimeter teams confirmed full containment. No additional movement from the pickup truck. No secondary individuals observed. The structure itself remained stable, but stability no longer meant safety. It only meant that whatever had been hidden inside had not yet tried to leave. Inside the room, the air felt heavier, not physically, but psychologically. The kind of heaviness that arrives when an investigation stops being about discovery and becomes about interpretation, because now that a suspect was physically present, every object in the room demanded meaning. An officer began reading rights aloud. The words were familiar, rehearsed, procedural, but they sounded different in this environment, surrounded by decades of visual documentation that had never been seen by the public, never tested in court, never validated beyond suspicion and fragments. The man did not interrupt. He listened, calmly, almost attentively. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke again, not in response to the rights, not in denial, not in protest. Instead, something closer to acknowledgement of timing, a statement about waiting, about duration, about how time changes the shape of memory when no one is watching it closely. The officers exchanged brief glances, not confusion exactly, but recalibration. This was not the reaction they had prepared for, not fear, not panic, not denial, something else entirely. One officer moved toward the wall of photographs, scanning it more closely. That's when the scale of the room began to shift in perception. It was no longer just a collection of investigative artifacts. It was a constructed narrative. Emily Carter's life, or at least her disappearance, had been broken into components and arranged like a system designed to preserve continuity over time. Locations marked in sequence. Dates layered in progression. Photographs pinned not randomly, but in deliberate intervals that suggested monitoring rather than reflection. This was not a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was an archive of attention, and that realization changed everything about how the room felt. Meanwhile, another officer noticed something near the base of the wall, a stack of folders. Not hidden, not secured, just placed carefully, almost as if waiting to be opened at the correct moment. One folder had a label written in faded ink, Inside, documents, handwritten notes, old receipts, timelines reconstructed with obsessive precision. Every piece of information inside pointed not to a single moment of violence, but to extended continuity. That detail unsettled the room more than anything else so far, because investigators are trained to understand interruption, a disappearance, a crime, a break in normal life. But continuity implies something different. It implies maintenance. It implies structure. It implies that whatever began in 1989 did not end when the world stopped looking. It continued. The man in the center of the room finally shifted his attention away from the wall and looked directly at the officers for the first time since being addressed. His expression was not emotional in any conventional sense. There was no visible anger, no visible regret, no visible confusion. Instead, there was something more difficult to categorize: familiarity with the inevitability of being observed. One officer asked about Emily Carter directly. The name alone changed the air in the room again. Even after decades, it carried weight that could not be neutralized by procedure. The response did not come immediately. When it did, it was not a confession, not a denial, not a story in the traditional sense. It was fragmented, referential, as if the answer could not exist as a single line of explanation, but only as pieces of perspective that had been arranged long before anyone entered the room. Outside, radio communication confirmed that additional forensic teams were en route. The house, once treated as a possible abandoned structure, was now classified as a controlled investigative site. Every surface, every object, every fragment of material would be documented, not just for evidence, but for reconstruction. Inside, however, time felt slower. One officer quietly moved to secure the evidence wall, photographing sections, preserving layout before anything could be disturbed. Another maintained visual contact with the subject, who remained standing but no longer moving. The stillness had returned, but it was no longer empty. It was occupied. Then something unexpected happened. A faint sound from deeper within the house. Not from the room, not from the hallway. Something further back. A mechanical shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible. All movement in the room paused. Attention shifted outward, away from the confrontation, away from the central figure, toward the direction of the sound. Because in investigations like this, unexpected noise is never meaningless. It is either structural decay or design. One officer moved toward the doorway, weapon raised, signaling for backup. The hallway outside remained dim, unchanged from earlier entry, but the sound came again, slightly louder this time, a low mechanical click, followed by a faint resonance, as if something hidden had just engaged after years of inactivity. Inside the room, the man finally spoke again. This time, not about identity, not about time, but about containment. The word landed differently than expected, not as threat, not as warning, but as description, as if acknowledging that the house itself was not just a place where something had happened, but something that had been structured to hold its own history in place. And in that moment, the investigation stopped being about a single disappearance. It became about what had been built around it. Something inside the house had just changed state, and everyone in the room, regardless of training or experience, understood the same thing at the same time. They had not yet seen everything that had been waiting in Ashford. The sound did not repeat immediately. That silence after was worse than the noise itself. Inside the hallway, the tactical officer froze for a fraction of a second, weapon still raised, flashlight beam locked on the dark stretch ahead. Nothing moved, no visible disturbance, no shadow crossing the frame. Just the same decayed interior, walls stained by time, floorboards bowed under years of neglect. But everyone had heard it. A mechanical click, precise, intentional, not the language of a collapsing house, the language of something designed. Back in the main room, the suspect expression changed for the first time in a subtle but undeniable way. Not fear, not surprise, something closer to recognition, as if the sound had been expected eventually, only not at this exact moment. One officer demanded clarification, voice sharp now, cutting through the tension that had thickened into something almost physical. What is in this house? The question was not procedural anymore. It was immediate, present-tense urgency replacing decades of archival distance. The man did not answer directly. Instead, he looked past him again toward the wall of photographs, toward Emily Carter's image, still pinned to the center like a fixed point in a shifting system. His gaze lingered there longer than anywhere else, and for a brief moment, something like restraint seemed to surface. Not emotional breakdown, not confession, but calculation. Outside, additional units arrived. Engines cut quietly. Doors opened and closed with controlled efficiency. The perimeter tightened further. The house, already contained, became more isolated in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if the world had agreed to focus entirely on this single structure and nothing beyond it mattered anymore. Inside, the hallway team advanced again. Slow, methodical, every step deliberate. The flashlight beam swept along the corridor and landed on a section of wall that looked no different from any other, until it did. A faint seam, not a crack from age. Too straight, too clean, a line that did not belong to natural decay. The officer leaned in slightly, adjusting angle. The seam widened visually under shifting light, not opening, revealing. The difference mattered. A panel, hidden, integrated into the structure, with a level of precision that suggested maintenance, not improvisation. Radio silence filled the team for a brief moment before confirmation was requested. Visual anomaly confirmed. Structural irregularity detected. Back in the main room, the suspect finally spoke again, but this time his voice carried something different. Not explanation, not denial. A kind of acknowledgement that the investigation had reached a layer beneath what was originally expected. The words were not dramatic. They were simple, almost ordinary, but their meaning was not. Not everything in this house is from the same time. That statement shifted the emotional weight of the entire operation, because up until now, the assumption had been decay, abandonment, a static crime scene frozen in the past. But that sentence introduced something else entirely: layering, modification, continuity of access. The hallway team requested authorization to open the panel. Approval came quickly. Too quickly. The panel was forced open carefully, not shattered. The material inside was older than expected, reinforced behind the visible wall. And behind it was not empty space. It was storage, boxes, carefully arranged, labeled in handwriting that did not belong to any official archive system. Not chaotic, not improvised, organized. One box was pulled forward. Dust shifted as it moved, but beneath the dust, markings remained intact. A name, Emily Carter. Inside the main room, the suspect finally moved again, just slightly, a shift of weight, a subtle adjustment in posture, not escape preparation, not resistance, something more controlled, as if the revelation of the hidden compartment was not breaking news, but a scheduled progression of something already understood. The officers in the hallway opened the first box. Inside were items that immediately disrupted the investigative narrative. Personal objects, not random evidence. Structured preservation. Things that suggested prolonged proximity to a life that had officially ended in documentation, but not in this physical system. A wristwatch, a school ID, a grocery receipt dated weeks after the disappearance. That detail alone forced a recalibration in the room. Weeks after, not days, not a misdated artifact. Weeks, meaning at minimum, the timeline of disappearance in official records was incomplete or deliberately misleading. The second box contained paper materials, handwritten notes, schedules, observations, patterns, not the chaotic ramblings of an unstable mind, but organized tracking, time-based entries, repeated references to movement, routine, and location shifts. And then, deeper inside, something else, a photograph, different from the one already known. This one less formal, less controlled. Emily Carter not posed, but captured in motion, walking, turning, existing within a frame that suggested continuity, rather than a single moment frozen in time. The implication hit the team silently at first. This was not just evidence of disappearance. This was evidence of duration. Back in the main room, Tension had not escalated outwardly, but inwardly it had changed shape entirely. The suspect remained standing, now no longer the center of confrontation, but part of a larger system being revealed in real time. One officer asked a question that no longer sounded purely investigative. How long? It was not clear whether the question referred to surveillance, to involvement, or to something even more difficult to define. The response came after a pause. Not a denial, not a confession. A single phrase. Long enough for it to stop being what you think it was. Outside, wind moved across the property for the first time that night in a noticeable way, brushing against broken fence lines and overgrown grass. The house, once perceived as static, now felt like an endpoint in a much longer structure that extended beyond its walls, beyond its history, beyond its abandonment. Inside, more boxes were being opened, each one extending the timeline further than expected, each one eroding the original assumption that this was a single-event disappearance. And with every new discovery, one realization began to settle quietly across every member of the investigation team. Emily Carter had not simply vanished into history. She had been held inside it, and whatever force had maintained that silence for decades had not been entirely inactive. It had been documenting it. The word documenting did not need to be spoken aloud inside the command structure for everyone to feel its weight. It hung there anyway, suspended between radio channels, camera feeds, and the fragmented breathing of a team that had just crossed from investigation into something far less familiar. Inside the hidden compartment, the discovery process continued under controlled light. Every item removed from the boxes was photographed, logged, and sealed, but procedure could not neutralize implication. A wristwatch stopped at an unknown hour. A school ID that should have been obsolete within days of the disappearance. Paper records that did not belong to any official investigative file, yet reference dates that extended beyond the known moment Emily Carter was last seen. And then came the entries that made the entire sequence shift again. Handwritten notes referencing weather patterns weeks after the disappearance. Mentions of routine movement. Descriptions of behavior that implied observation over time, not a single incident. One officer read a line twice, silently at first, then again under his breath, as if repetition could change its meaning. It did not. The wording remained precise, unemotional, structured. Emily was not described as missing. She was described as present, not always visible, not always accounted for, but present within a map routine that stretched forward in time instead of stopping at a point of disappearance. Back in the main room, the suspect's posture had not changed significantly, but his attention had shifted, not toward the officers, not toward the evidence wall, but toward the sounds coming from the hallway feed. He was listening now more than responding, as if the unfolding discovery carried no surprise, only sequence. A second wave of evidence retrieval began in the hidden space. Deeper boxes, previously untouched, were opened. These were not arranged casually. They were layered in a way that suggested prioritization. Older materials at the bottom, more recent at the top. A structure that implied maintenance over time. And then a detail emerged that changed the tone inside the team again. A calendar, not an official one, not printed for commercial or institutional use. A handwritten tracking system spanning multiple years. Dates marked with symbols, patterns repeated across months. Certain days annotated with brief notes, others left blank in deliberate spacing. But what mattered was not the structure itself. It was continuity. There were no breaks. No abseggesting abandonment. No sudden cessation of entries that would align with the expected closure of a cold case narrative. Instead, it continued, year after year, even into periods where the case was officially considered inactive. The implication spread quietly through the team, not as conversation but as recognition. Something had been maintained here, not just evidence, not just memory, a system of tracking that outlived the investigation itself. In the hallway, the structural anomaly identified earlier was now being fully examined. The panel concealed a narrow space behind the wall, not large enough to be a room, but sufficient for storage and movement of materials. The architecture suggested intentional modification after original construction, not a hidden basement, not a secret chamber in the theatrical sense, but something more subtle and more unsettling. an extension built into normality. The second compartment contained items that were even more recent, photographs with improved clarity, suggesting modern equipment, printed documents with updated formatting, notes that referenced digital timestamps alongside handwritten observation. The system had evolved. It had not stopped. Outside the house, additional forensic units arrived with specialized equipment. Ground-penetrating scans began mapping the property perimeter. Early readings suggested irregularities beneath sections of the structure, but interpretation was still underway. The data was incomplete, but it introduced a new possibility. The house was not the full extent of the system. It might only be the surface. Inside the main room, tension rose again, but differently now. The suspect was no longer the sole focal point. The environment itself had become part of the investigation. Every wall, every seam, every structural inconsistency now carried potential meaning. An officer returned from the hallway, holding a sealed envelope found within one of the later boxes. Unlike the other materials, this one was not preserved in layers of dust. It appeared more recent. The paper was less degraded. The ink sharper. No label. No classification. Just a name written on the front. Emily Carter. Inside a single sheet. Short, direct, not investigative in tone, not procedural. A statement. The content was read silently first, then shared to the team in fragments of disbelief that did not immediately translate into understanding. It did not describe a crime. It described a timeline, a continuation, a pattern of presence that extended beyond what the original disappearance narrative allowed for. It referenced movement outside the house. It referenced observation in external locations. It referenced moments where Emily was seen in public spaces after the official date of disappearance. Each reference contradicted the foundational assumption of the case. Each one expanded the timeline instead of closing it. Back in the main room, one officer finally confronted the suspect directly with the emerging contradiction. The question was not about guilt anymore. It was about structure, about explanation. How is any of this possible? The suspect did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, as if orienting himself not toward the officers, but toward the house itself, toward the invisible architecture that had just been partially revealed. When he spoke, his tone carried no urgency, no defensiveness, only correction, because you assumed the story ended where it actually continued. The hallway team reported another anomaly immediately after. A faint sound again, deeper within the structure, not mechanical this time, softer, almost rhythmic, like movement within a confined space that had not been accounted for in any floor plan. All eyes shifted again, because the house, which had already revealed hidden storage, modified walls, and extended compartments, was now suggesting something even more complicated, that the spaces they had opened were not the end, only the beginning layer. And beneath everything already uncovered, there was still something responding to their presence, something that had not yet been seen, but was no longer silent. The rhythm did not repeat like a machine. It repeated like breath, slow, irregular, intentionally hidden behind the structure of the house itself, as if the building had learned how to disguise living sound inside old wood and hollow space. Every officer in the hallway heard it differently at first. Some thought it was ventilation, others thought it was shifting debris, but the shared silence that followed confirmed what no one wanted to articulate immediately. It was not the house settling. It was something inside it. The flashlight beams tightened their focus, narrowing toward the deeper section of the hidden compartment network. The narrow passage behind the wall panels extended further than expected, not just a storage recess, but a transitional corridor, barely wide enough for movement. The architecture here no longer resembled residential construction. It resembled adaptation. Every step forward was recorded. Every surface scanned visually before contact. Dust patterns showed long-term absence of disturbance, but intermittent disruptions, marks that did not align with either full abandonment or constant use. It was something in between, something maintained at intervals. And then they found the second passage point, not marked on any structural blueprint, not visible from the main interior rooms. A concealed hatch embedded into the floor behind stacked boxes, its edges reinforced, its hinge mechanism recently oiled compared to the surrounding decay. Recent. That word spread through the team without being spoken aloud. The implication was immediate. Whatever system existed here was not historical only. It had been interacted with recently enough to leave physical trace. Back in the main room, the suspect had stopped speaking, not from refusal, but from observation. His gaze remained steady, occasionally shifting toward the sound sources coming to the radio feed. It was as if he was tracking not the officers themselves, but the progression of discovery, step by step, as though each revelation was expected in sequence rather than feared. One officer in the room demanded clarification again, but the tone had changed. Less command, more urgency shaped by disbelief. The answer no longer mattered for interrogation purposes alone. It mattered for understanding scale. What is beneath this house? The suspect did not answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, and for the first time, something like fatigue appeared in his posture. Not physical exhaustion, but the weight of prolonged containment. Not imprisonment in the legal sense, but in the sense of sustained structure. When he finally spoke, his words did not clarify. They reframed. You are only looking at what was meant to be found. That statement caused a brief pause in the room, because it implied intention behind discovery itself. It suggested that the hidden compartments, the photographs, the records, even the visible anomalies, might not represent accidental exposure but controlled revelation. Meanwhile, in the lower passage, the tactical team began preparing the hatch for opening. Hydraulic tools were positioned carefully to avoid destabilizing surrounding structure. Every movement was deliberate because the environment was no longer considered inert. It was considered active in design. The hatch opened with resistance. Not loud, not explosive. Controlled force against reinforced ceiling. And when it finally lifted, the space beneath exhaled a smell that immediately shifted the emotional tone of the entire operation. Not decay alone, not simple abandonment, but the layered scent of long-enclosed air mixed with manufactured containment. Materials preserved too deliberately, too consistently. Flashlights descended into darkness. What they revealed was not a tunnel, in the traditional sense. It was a chamber, narrow, elongated, structured with purpose. Not natural excavation, not basement construction, but a space carved and maintained with intent that suggested long-term usage beyond residential function. Along the walls were additional markings. Not random graffiti, not damage. Records, dates, symbols, repetitions of the same name. Emily Carter, but not in the past tense. Present tense annotations. The discovery changed the entire operational framing again. This was no longer just evidence collection. It was environmental reconstruction of a system that appeared to have extended beneath the visible world of the house itself. One officer whispered that this should not be possible under normal structural logic. The house was not built for this kind of sublevel extension, which meant modification had occurred later. Quietly, systematically, over time, and then, deeper in the chamber, something unexpected appeared in the flashlight beam. A chair, not abandoned, not broken, positioned as if recently used. And beside it, a small table with objects arranged in a pattern that suggested current relevance rather than historical storage. A notebook, a set of tools, a series of printed pages with updated timestamps. One page was still open. The writing on it was recent enough that ink sheen remained visible under angled light. Back in the main room, the radio transmission describing this discovery caused a shift in everyone listening. The suspect finally moved his attention fully toward the hallway feed, and for the first time since the operation began, his composure showed something closer to disruption. Not panic, but recognition that the investigation was now entering territory beyond controlled narrative. The officers in the lower chamber hesitated, not because of threat, but because of implication. Everything they had found so far suggested preservation, maintenance, continuity. But this space suggested presence that might extend beyond documentation. And then the radio crackled again. A voice from deeper inside the chamber team confirmed a final detail that changed everything again. Fresh markings on the wall. Not decades old. Not even months. Recent enough to indicate interaction within a time frame measured in days, not years. The implication was no longer abstract. Whatever system had been built beneath this house was not simply historical containment. It was still active, and somewhere inside the layered structure of Ashford, beneath abandoned wood and sealed compartments and decades of investigative silence, something that continued operating long after everyone believed the story had ended. Not a memory, not a relic, a process, still running. The word active did not echo in the chamber. It settled. It settled into the walls, into the narrow air pocket beneath the house, into the breath of every officer standing in that confined underground space where time no longer behaved in a straight line. Active implied presence. Presence implied continuity. Continuity implied that nothing they had uncovered so far belonged purely to the past. The flashlight beam steadied on the chair again. Empty, but not abandoned in the way empty spaces are supposed to feel. The positioning mattered too much. The alignment with the table, the distance from the wall, the way the notebook lay open, not closed, as if someone had only just stepped away rather than disappeared years ago. One officer slowly approached, boots careful against the floor. Each step sounded too loud, as if the chamber itself was listening and measuring intrusion. He reached the table and stopped without touching anything at first, eyes scanning the open page. The handwriting was clean, controlled, not rushed. The ink still carried a faint sheen that suggested recent contact, not archival preservation. The page contained structured entries, time markers, short observations, references to movement patterns above ground, not descriptions of events long past, but notes that referenced ongoing conditions, and then a line that changed the atmosphere entirely. Adjustment completed after last visit. No date attached. No context explaining what adjustment meant. No indication of who the visitor was. Just implication. Back in the main structure of the house, the suspect had stopped responding entirely to questions. He was listening now, fully, as the radio relayed details from below. His posture had shifted again, less composed than before, but still controlled, as if recalculating the moment the investigation transitioned from observation into exposure. One officer in the main room repeated the question that now felt heavier than before. How recent is this? The answer came not from the suspect, but from the chamber team through radio interference that briefly cracked and stabilized. Too recent. That phrase carried no procedural value, but it carried emotional weight, because it meant the system beneath the house had not just preserved itself, it had updated itself. The chamber expanded further than first mapped. A second corridor branched off from the main underground space, narrower, reinforced in sections with newer material than the surrounding structure. That detail mattered more than any single object so far. It meant maintenance. It meant replacement. It meant selective reinforcement over time. As they advanced, another wall section revealed markings that were not written in the same hand as the notebook above. Different pressure, different stroke patterns, different cadence, multiple authorship. That realization introduced something even more complex into the investigation. This system may not have been maintained by a single individual over time, but by a rotation or succession or involvement that had never been accounted for in the original case framework. Above ground, Ashford's silence felt different now. Not peaceful, not abandoned, but divided. Like the town itself was sitting on top of something that had been active beneath it while life continued on the surface without awareness. Inside the chamber, the team found a second object of significance. A small recording device. Not modern surveillance equipment, but a compact audio recorder with physical tape housing. Old technology, but not ancient, carefully preserved. Power indicators still faintly responsive. One officer hesitated before pressing play. The sound that emerged was distorted at first, stretched by time and environmental conditions, but gradually stabilized into something recognizable as human voice. Not a conversation. A monologue. Measured, controlled, documenting. The content was not immediately about events. It was about process, about observation cycles, about maintenance of continuity conditions. The phrasing was clinical, almost detached from moral framing, as if what was being described existed outside traditional definitions of harm or crime. Then a segment that included a name. Emily Carter. The room tightened again. Because hearing the name was no longer new, But hearing it in this context, recorded, preserved, and embedded into a system beneath the house, shifted its meaning again. It was no longer just an identifier. It was a reference point in an ongoing structure. Back in the main room, the suspect finally spoke again, but more quietly than before. "You are hearing what you were never meant to find intact." That sentence did not function as confession or denial. It functioned as boundary definition, as if acknowledging that the investigation had crossed into a layer that was not supposed to survive exposure. The chamber team continued playback. The recording shifted slightly, introducing background sound, movement, metallic contact, something being adjusted in real time during the recording itself. That detail suggested the audio had not been made in isolation, but during active presence within the system. Then a pause in the recording, followed by a phrase that did not match any prior investigative assumption. "She remained within expected range." That sentence collapsed several interpretations at once. It suggested monitoring beyond disappearance. It suggested continuity of observation. It suggested that official absence and recorded presence were not aligned in the system that created this documentation. One officer stopped moving entirely, not out of fear, out of recalibration, because every framework they had used, missing person, abduction, cold case resolution, was beginning to fail under the weight of a system that behaved like something else entirely. Above ground, additional teams requested structural engineers. The house was no longer just a crime scene. It was now a mapped anomaly with multiple confirmed sublevels and structural modifications not consistent with original architecture. Inside the chamber, the recording ended abruptly, not faded, not cut naturally, stopped, followed by silence that felt more deliberate than absence. Then, from deeper in the underground space, a final discovery, a narrow opening beyond the chamber's far wall, not previously detected in scans, not previously accessible, and inside it, faint light, not flashlight reflection, not environmental glow, but a steady, controlled illumination source, recent enough to still function, active enough to be visible, and for the first time since the operation began, the investigation was no longer just uncovering what had been hidden beneath Ashford. It was looking at something that had been prepared to be found, at exactly the moment it was being found. Bạn có pham có vẻ là muốn viết tiếp phần 11. Mình viết luôn nhé. Inside the narrow opening, the light did not flicker. It held steady. That detail alone was enough to change the emotional weight of the entire underground chamber. Old systems fail. Batteries drain. Darkness always wins eventually in spaces like this. But this light did not behave like something surviving by chance. It behaved like something maintained. The passage beyond the opening was tighter than anything seen so far, barely wide enough for a single person. The walls were smoother here, less like excavation and more like intentional shaping. Not natural decay, not structural collapse. Purpose. The lead officer hesitated for only a moment before signaling forward movement. Every instinct in the team said this was no longer standard search protocol. This had moved into something else. Something closer to containment of an unknown system than investigation of a crime scene. They entered. The air changed immediately. Cleaner, drier, less stagnant than the chamber behind them. That difference was impossible to ignore. It meant ventilation. It meant maintenance. It meant separation from the rest of the house, structure above. The passage led forward in a straight line for several meters before opening into a second space. Smaller than expected, but more controlled. This room was not built for storage. It was built for observation. A single chair faced a wall-mounted surface, flat, pale, and reflective under the controlled lighting. Not a screen in the modern sense, but something more analog in structure, yet clearly used for viewing or documentation. Nearby, a set of organized materials sat on a narrow shelf. Notebooks, labeled folders, and sealed envelopes arranged in chronological order. Everything in this room suggested ongoing use, not historical record, active workflow. One officer stepped closer to the shelf and pulled a folder forward. The label was simple. A date, recent, far more recent than the original disappearance timeline should allow. Inside were printed notes, structured logs, and short observational entries. The language was consistent with what had been found earlier beneath the house. Controlled, clinical, procedural in tone. But now the references had changed. They no longer spoke only about past disappearance. They referenced external locations, public spaces, movements in Ashford, observations marked with times that aligned with modern years. The implications settled slowly but unmistakably across the team. Whatever system had existed here was not only preserving history, it had been extending surveillance beyond the house itself. Back in the main structure, the suspect's silence had deepened. He was no longer responding to questions. He was listening to the radio feed, tracking every new discovery as if it were unfolding according to an internal sequence he already understood. When asked again about the underground space, he finally spoke, but not in clarification, in correction. You are not inside what you think you entered. That sentence did not help the investigation. It destabilized it further, because it suggested misclassification. It suggested that even now, with multiple layers exposed, the team had not yet correctly identified the nature of what they were standing inside. Meanwhile, deeper in the observation room, another object was discovered. A ledger, heavier than the others. Older bindings, but maintained condition. Unlike the scattered notebooks earlier, this one was structured with rigid formatting. Entries divided into time blocks, each block containing observations, annotations, and cross-references. But the most disturbing detail was consistency. The entries did not show interruption. No gaps across years. No indication of system failure. No break in continuity, even during periods when the house was officially considered abandoned. One officer flipped forward through pages. The entries continued, month after month, year after year, extending into time frames that matched modern calendars. That realization forced a new interpretation across the entire team. This system had not been dormant and reactivated. It had been continuously maintained, even when no one believed it existed. A sudden sound came again from deeper within the passage network. Not mechanical this time, not structural. Footsteps. Soft, controlled, distant but unmistakable. Every flashlight snapped toward the direction of the sound. No one spoke. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. But it was no longer empty silence. It was occupied silence. Back in the observation room, the controlled surface on the wall, previously assumed to be passive, flickered very slightly. Not enough to be called activation, but enough to indicate response. One officer approached it slowly. The surface reflected light differently as he moved closer. Not like glass, not like metal, something between. And then, for the first time, a faint change appeared on its surface. Not text, not image, a shift in brightness, as if something behind it had detected proximity. In the main house above, the suspect finally lifted his head slightly, as if sensing the same shift through distance alone. And in that shared moment, above ground, underground, and within the sealed structure connecting them, the investigation reached a point where discovery no longer felt like uncovering the past. It felt like triggering a system that had been waiting for recognition. And now that recognition had arrived. It was beginning to respond. The response did not arrive as sound at first. It arrived as light, a faint, uneven pulse behind the reflective surface in the observation room. Subtle at the beginning, almost dismissible as electrical instability, but it didn't behave like malfunction. It behaved like acknowledgement, as if something on the other side had registered presence and was deciding whether to continue remaining hidden. Every officer in the underground structure froze in place, not because they had been ordered to, because instinctively, everyone understood the same thing at the same time. Nothing in this house was passive anymore. Above ground, the suspect stood still in the main room, his attention no longer divided between officers and walls. Now it was fully directed downward, as if distance meant nothing. His expression was no longer composed in the same way it had been earlier. Not fear exactly, not surprise, but a kind of resignation that suggested the system had reached its final phase of exposure. Back below, the reflective surface flickered again. This time, the change was clearer. Not imagery, not words, but structure forming in layers of brightness and shadow. like something attempting to render itself through a medium never designed to display it. The effect was unstable, incomplete, but intentional. One officer whispered that it looked like a signal. Another corrected him immediately. Not a signal, a response. The difference mattered, because a signal implies sending. A response implies awareness. The chamber behind them, the passage network, the observation room, all of it now felt like a single interconnected system rather than isolated discoveries. The implication no longer pointed to hidden compartments or stage preservation. It pointed to architecture of intent. And that intent had just reacted. The reflective surface stabilized for a brief moment, long enough for something new to appear. Not a full image, a fragment, a recognizable shape, a location, not of the house itself, but of somewhere outside, a street in Ashford, dim lighting, familiar geography, a place that should not be part of this underground system at all. Yet it was there, embedded into the surface like memory rendered into infrastructure. Then another flicker, another fragment, a figure standing at distance, not clearly defined, not fully resolved, but positioned in a way that immediately forced recognition across the team. Not identity, but implication, someone being observed, not in the past. Now, that realization hit the room harder than anything before it, because it broke the final assumption holding the investigation together, that everything they had found belonged to history. It didn't. It was current, active, ongoing. The officer closest to the surface reached out instinctively, then stopped just short of contact. Something about the display discouraged physical interaction, not through warning, but through certainty that touching it would not yield control, only confirmation of participation. Behind him, the ledger discovered earlier on the shelf began to shift slightly on its own, not physically moving across the surface, but pages subtly adjusting, as if responding to the same stimulus. Above ground, radios crackled with fragmented updates. External teams reported unusual electrical fluctuations across the property grid, not widespread failure. Localized instabilities centered directly beneath the structure. The house was no longer just being investigated. It was reacting to the investigation. Inside the observation room, the reflective surface changed again. This time, instead of external imagery, it displayed something more abstract, a sequence, repetitive markers, timelines collapsing into overlapping layers. And then, clearly enough for the entire team to understand without translation, one repeated element anchored through the pattern. Emily Carter, but not as a static reference, as a recurring node, a point that appeared across multiple layers of the system, not tied to a single moment, but distributed through a continuous structure. That realization altered everything, because it reframed the entire investigation. Emily Carter was not just a missing person at the center of a cold case. She was a reference point of a system that had been built around her continuity in time. One officer finally spoke what everyone was beginning to understand, but no one wanted to fully articulate. This isn't containment, it's mapping. The moment the word was spoken, the reflective surface stabilized one last time, and then displayed something that was not fragmentary, not symbolic, but direct. A single phrase, rendered clearly enough to be undeniable. Observation complete. Silence followed. Not the silence of absence, the silence of conclusion. Above ground, in the main room, the suspect exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement that whatever had been maintained beneath Ashford for decades had reached the final stage of exposure. The officers in the underground structure remained frozen, watching the surface dim slowly, returning to stillness. But it was not the same stillness as before, because now they knew the system had not been discovered. It had been finished. And somewhere in the structure beneath the house, beyond compartments, beyond chambers, beyond observation layers built across decades of hidden continuity, something had recorded that completion and stopped responding. The stillness after observation complete was not emptiness. It was closure. Not the closure investigators usually hope for. No clean resolution. No satisfying collapse of mystery into truth. But something colder. A system that had acknowledged being seen and in doing so, had decided it no longer needed to continue speaking. The reflective surface in the observation room dimmed slowly, like a screen losing power without fully shutting down. The fragments of Ashford streets vanished first, then the layered timelines, then the faint structural overlays that had once suggested Emily Carter as a persistent node within a larger pattern. What remained was blankness. But blankness, in this context, did not feel like absence. It felt like withdrawal, as if something had stepped back deliberately. Above ground, the suspect remained standing in the same position. No struggle, no attempt to move, no change in posture that would indicate panic or escape planning. Instead, there was something closer to final acceptance, not of guilt in the legal sense, but of completion in the structural sense. One officer in the main room demanded clarification again, but the words felt thinner now, stripped of authority by everything that had just been witnessed below. The suspect did not respond immediately. His gaze remained lowered, not toward the officers, but toward the floor, as if the house itself had become the final point of reference. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier control, only finality. It only continues when it is being seen. That sentence did not function as explanation. It functioned as termination. Below ground, the team in the observation room and passage network began a careful reassessment, not of evidence but of state. The system they had uncovered no longer displayed active response. The ledger no longer shifted. The reflective surface no longer flickered. Even the faint mechanical presence that had been detected earlier had ceased. But that cessation was not interpreted as safety. It was interpreted as completion of cycle. One officer moved cautiously back through the passage, confirming the chamber behind them. The chair was still there, the notebook still open, the structured environment unchanged. But now it felt inert, like a mechanism that had finished its final task and was no longer required to maintain motion. And then something unexpected arrived through the radio from the surface team. External monitoring had picked up a final anomaly. Not inside the house, not beneath it, but across multiple points in Ashford simultaneously. Old systems and used traffic cameras, archived municipal sensors, outdated surveillance infrastructure that had been decommissioned years ago, had briefly activated on their own. Each one displayed a single frame. Empty streets. No movement. No subjects. Just location markers. As if something had briefly synchronized with the town itself before disengaging. The technicians attempted to isolate the trigger, but the signals vanished as quickly as they appeared. No trace remained. Inside the house, the suspect finally moved. Slowly. Not toward escape. Not toward resistance. But toward the center of the main room. The officers tensed, but no command followed. There was no clear procedural framework left for what was unfolding. Arrest protocol applied to individuals, not to systems that appear to have already concluded their operation. He stopped beneath the central light, looked upward slightly, and spoke one final time, not to the officers, not to the investigation, but to the space itself. You were never meant to find the ending. Below ground, the reflective surface briefly flickered one last time in a single, isolated pulse. Not imagery, not data. Just a confirmation signal, without content. Then it went dark completely. No power surge, no failure alarm, no mechanical shutdown, just absence of response. The chamber system, the observation structure, the layer compartments, all of it settled into inert silence at once, as if a switch had been flipped somewhere beyond physical reach. Above ground, the suspect did not resist when approached. There was no struggle. No dramatic confrontation, only controlled procedure as officers moved in to secure him. His compliance was not passive in the emotional sense. It was procedural in the narrative sense, as if his role had concluded the moment the system stopped responding. Outside, Asher remained unchanged. But the investigation teams did not feel the same, because what they had uncovered was no longer just a cold case. It was a closed loop, a system that had operated through observation, documentation, and continuation until the moment it was fully observed in return. And once that observation was complete, it ended itself, not with destruction, not with confession, but with silence that no longer carried anything beneath it.